All right, guys, what do you think for 1? Add it. No, 1 is true. A census is when you've sampled and you've asked absolutely everyone in the entire population. That's what a census is.
This wouldn't be good.
Yeah, it's that census is a very specific definition of a certain type of sample. Okay? All right, what do you think for number 2? What'd you get? B as in boy, yes, the mean of this year's students is a statistic. Are we pretty clear on statistic and parameter at this point? Yes, okay. All right. Well, let's keep going. All right, let's look at our sampling design. So this is how you pick people for a study, and how you do this can determine the accuracy of your sampling method. The information you get from it, it can be very biased or it can be pretty accurate. So again, I'll give you a chance to read through this. I'm not going to read to you. So guys, let's talk about the 4 methods of selecting your samples. So we have voluntary response sampling and convenience sampling. So convenience sampling, let's say I wanted to survey and get information from the entire student body. And I was like, I'm going to sample 30 people. Look, there's 30 people in my classroom right now. That's very convenient for me to do. I'll ask you guys. This may not be a very good representation of the entire student body.
Like, you're asking, that's like trying to glean the entire, how someone will vote in a presidential election by just surveying Detroit. That will not get you a very accurate.
It's not very representative of the entire population. You guys are almost all seniors. You're obviously all in an AP math. That may not be representative of every student here. Okay? But it would be very convenient for me to sample you guys. So that's convenient sampling. Voluntary response is when you like post something and only people who want to respond to you do. Because who do you think actually responds to a survey question?
People who just see it.
Okay, people who can see it, but not everyone who sees it is going to respond. People who like are passionate about it one way or another, people who actually care are going to respond. But that again may not be representative of everyone. Okay? So those are not good ways to conduct your sampling method. But there are some appropriate ways. You want to make sure it's random. They list them at the bottom here. Simple random sample, systematic random, stratified random, and cluster sampling. Go ahead and jot down stratified random sampling. That's some from all. And then cluster sampling is all from some. I think that helps you differentiate between those two. And we'll do some practice sampling to make sure you guys understand the different methods here. We'll talk about it a little more on the next slide. So stratified, that's where you're like putting it in different groups, but the group has all of your different subsets in it. So you're getting some from all the different like subset groups. Whereas cluster is you might cluster like all the freshmen. Okay, well you're going to get all of that, but that's not going to necessarily represent everybody. So it's interesting the way you have to do it. We're going to do it with this sampling down the river problem here in just a minute. Here's a little more. I don't think you need all my underlining. little more explanation. Again, this is in your packet, so go ahead and read for a minute. You notice how there's some form of randomness to each of these, whether it's completely random or we're taking a random sample of the groups, like something is randomly happening when you're doing this, okay? That's what makes these somewhat appropriate methods for selection. All right, guys, go ahead and flip the page. We've got a few more questions to answer here. Let's do... Yeah, you can go all the way through 7. Okay, so you're going to be flipping a few pages here. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Mm-hmm. So simple random would be like, I just take all of your names right from the hat, pull that. Systematic would be like, okay, I've numbered all of them, and now I'm going to pick every 4.
They're like basically the same thing.
Yeah, well, it's a little more structured.
Yeah.
So, like, the other way, I can number all of you, and then just do random measure on my calculator, and you know, or I could be like, it's still numbers, but I might take, it may show up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
But like,
Systematic, that's not
but the numbers are assigned randomly because they're not ordered.
sometimes you are, it could be like, oh, I should wash it.
So like, there's like which height.
Yeah. Yeah.
But would that be that way if you like order by height? Or do you find the average
On
for
the,
the class?
yeah, parking.
So like this one selects this person's average.
I know.
Yeah. The only thing about it is that I don't mention it is like, oh, it's not good outside, but you can go down mine.
So, I'm going to hold so the meeting call is going to be like, I'm going to call 100 people at a Elm Trump rally who they're going to vote for president. And say that that's sampling the entire population. That's convenience polling, and well, it's convenient if you're there. Or like, that would be like really, you would get a very high result.
Yeah, I know.
Way to go about it. All right, guys, have you done 3 through 7?
What?
Not quite? Okay, I'll give you another minute.
Sorry for calling you a jerk, even if I don't.
Yeah.
I should know how to call it.
Well, yes, I was hoping you were kidding, Beckett. But yeah, just think about words that you say.
It's like I want to go up. I think you're telling me your friend. But they also want to go and talk to you. And I asked you about your phone.
Yeah, did you get rid of Elsa?
Are you just kicking Elsa out back there? Are they just kicking you out? What's happening? Oh, both of you? Oh, okay. All three of you. Oh, cool. All right, are we good now? 3 through 7? All right, number 3, what'd you get? B. B, actually. That is systematic. Picking every 5th person in line. That is a very, structured approach. That's what systematic is, okay? They're lined up. You're just doing every 5th. What about number 4? A. Yes, good. Any questions on that? That's convenient. You're just finding the 50 you'd like to talk to. Okay. Number 5, what do you think? E. Good. That is stratified. Okay. 6. Good. And then 7. You have to read a little more.
False.
Okay. You could argue this either way. So, I'm going to go with true, but that's only if you're talking about selection bias. There are other kinds of bias that exist. So if you read it as if it's eliminating all kinds of bias, then I would take false. Are you going to back it up that way, Pat?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah. Yeah, and we're going to get into more detail with the different kinds of bias that go into it. The question design, the way it's worded, that can bias the responses you're going to get. If it's an interview type of survey, the person doing the interview, how someone's asking you questions can definitely change your response to those questions. Okay. Let's see. All right, guys, let's keep going. All right, let's look at sample design or sampling technique. That's how you pick your participants. Some of them are very much prone to selection bias. So the ones we want to write in here are voluntary response, and convenience response. Or just convenience, that's easy. Okay? And I think you're starting to see that those two are not going to give you unbiased answers. Okay? What kind of sampling methods eliminate selection bias? What do you think? Okay, SRS, yes. What else? Simple random sample and stratified. We don't really call that SRS because, yeah, SRS always stands for simple random. So then stratified, it just is stratified.
All from some.
They're not perfect, but those would go in there. Systematic would work.
And convenience.
No, not convenience. What did I forget? Cluster?
Yeah.
Stratified and cluster. Yeah. Okay. What would be the only way to eliminate all the bias, at least from a sampling standpoint?
Have that sample be every single person in the population.
Which is called a census, yes. Yeah, the only way you're going to completely avoid all bias is if you actually ask every single person who is in your population. That's not realistic most of the time, so that's why we try to pick an appropriate method of sampling.
So who shows us all 300 million people in America?
It's not going to work very well. Okay, we are on to questions 8 through 10. Eight through 10. Try those. We'll talk about more bias here in a minute. You'll have to like explain based on the situation. Random number generators. There's not a lot. It's a very weird unit. It's a ton of vocab, yeah. You know, do vocab. All right, guys, how are we doing on 8, 9, and 10? Wait a minute. Okay. 8, 9, and 10. How are you guys?
Yeah.
Got them? Okay. We haven't really defined the biases all that well yet, so we'll see how you do on the answers, especially for 9. And guys, let's just talk about 8 and 9 first, and we'll talk about our biases. Then I'm going to have you do some sampling and see how you answer 10 after you do the sampling, okay? What do you think for number 8, true or false? True. That's what bias is doing, is you're not accurately representing the population. That's failure. Any kind of bias. Yeah. All right. Let's look at your other kinds of bias, and then we'll go to the answer for 9, okay? Maybe. Do I not have these written anywhere? Oh, I don't have these written anywhere. All right, guys, so let's look at the types of bias there. Okay, you have response bias, which includes question wording, interviewer bias, order of choices, and honesty. So let's think about question wording. How could that bias responses? What do you think?
It says like contradicting words like agree and never. Almost like this can confuse someone.
Yep, definitely. Having very strong wording in it. What else?
Also, when you do like, do you agree or not? What about the middle?
Right, yep, if they leave out any way to say you feel neutral, that's going to lead to some bias. Sometimes the wording can just kind of lead you towards an answer, like it almost accuses you of, like this next one talks about, is it immoral? Like it may lead you down one emotional path in answering the questions, which is not just straightforward trying to gather data. Okay, what about interviewer bias? Okay, what if I am interviewing you versus like your friend is interviewing you? Are you going to answer questions exactly the same? I don't know. Yeah, some of you might. Some of you might not. Okay, but that could influence you. You may want to impress the interviewer, or you don't feel like you can be honest with the interviewer. Anything like that could bias it. Order of choices. What might that be dealing with?
Oh, it's like the first thing choice.
Yeah, as you're going through, you get tired of reading the whole list. You're like, oh yeah, that sounds good. And then honesty. What might that be? Should not be too tricky. Yeah, the responder, if they're not being honest, that's going to bias your study, but you can't exactly control that. So that's response bias, okay? Non-response bias. All right, guys, so non-response bias. What this means is you made contact with someone and they're refusing to respond to your survey or your question, whatever it is. Like you're at a mall and you walk up to someone and you say, hey, I'd like to ask you a few questions about whatever, and they just say no and walk away. That's non-response bias, okay? So you've made contact. Could be a phone survey. You call, someone answers the phone, but then they don't want to answer your questions. You what?
I do that all the time.
You do that all the time. You're just like, no, I don't want to talk to you. Yeah. The issue there is maybe all the people who are not responding to you are doing that for a very specific reason, and you're like missing out on a, part of the population that you're trying to represent because they don't want to answer your questions. Okay, so you just have to be careful with non-response bias. Undercoverage kind of goes along with that. You're just completely missing like a subset of the population. A group is undercovered, okay? Like that's what you're, that's what you're doing. You're just not representing everyone
So
well.
if you're only pulling in English, then don't be surprised when a lot of like Latino people don't respond.
And then the voluntary response bias, we talked about that a little bit. That's if you're only getting responses from people who are seeking out the opportunity to respond to you, you're only getting the people that are very passionate about that topic, pro or con, whatever it is you're asking. But that's what voluntary response bias is going to do. You're getting people with strong opinions one way or another. You will not get the middle of the road people to respond. Does that make sense? Okay, so based on that, what did you say for number 9? You want to read it again? C. Yeah, it's the way the question is worded. Okay? Do you agree that nuclear weapons should never be used because they are immoral? Like, that's definitely being like, what, are you immoral? You feel this way? So, okay, that's the wording of the question that's doing that. All right, questions so far? Okay, we're going to do a little sampling activity here. Find question 10 for me. So the one that was the true-false about the cluster sample and the stratified random sample. Back in your notes packet. So we're leaving the farming, going back to the notes. You guys are here with me? Back in the notes. All right, guys, question 10. It says the cluster sample divides the population into homogeneous groups, and an SRS from each group is taken, and these selected individuals are surveyed. Then it talks about stratified random too, and it's asking you true or false. What do you think? False. False. Yeah, tell me more about a cluster sample. How does that actually work?
All from some?
Yeah, so when it's cluster sampling, you break your population or whatever you're looking at into these subgroups, but then you randomly select an entire cluster. Okay, it's not sampling within that cluster. You take the whole cluster. Okay, it's not. If it's stratified, then you do the simple random sample of that subgroup, however it exists. With stratifying, there's usually a reason you've broken them into specific groups. It's based on some characteristic that the surveyor thinks matters. Okay. All right. So let's do some practice of how we would talk about these groups here. So this is next to that page, find this one. So we've got our 20 students here planning a field trip, and only 8 of the 20 can go. We have to figure out how we're going to select a simple random sample. So I know it says select 2, let's not do 2. Just describe to me how you would do a simple random sample. So let's go through this one together so you can see what I'm looking for. All right, guys, so this is where you're describing how you're going to run your sample. This is where you have to actually write a decent amount for me. So the first step, what we would do, we're going to write the name of each student on a piece of paper. Like, you have to go this detailed.
Then you just put them in a hat and pick 8 names.
Yep. And maybe we should stay on a separate piece of paper. So you know, like, every person has their own piece of paper with their name on it. Okay, then we're going to put those 20 pieces of paper in a hat. Okay. All right, then blindly, like you're closing your eyes and reaching into this hat, blindly select 8 pieces of paper. What do you think, with or without replacement? Without replacement. And then your final step is just, these are your 8 people selected to go to the Capitol. Okay. Does that make sense how much detail I want to see? None of that is really hard, but it does take a little bit of time for you to write everything out. And does that make sense? Simple random sample. Yeah.
I want to question like this. You don't actually have to like do a random sample. You just explain how you would.
Right. Yes. How would you do this?
Also,
Yep.
the answer to number 10 was that false.
It was false. Yes. Yeah. All right. Are we okay with this one? Make sense what I'm looking for? Okay. Turn the page. I want you to try the next one. This time you're going to do a stratified random sample. So think how you're going to do your strata so that you end up with 8 people at the end. Take the time, read through it. Think how you want to do it. Think what would make sense for the different groups.
Yes, like what are your strata? You gotta think what's gonna be the same. And you guys might not all do the same thing. See what you come up with.
Hey guys, talk to each other. See if you agree. See if you have the same idea for groupings. And Colin, are you on this one with the stratified one? Or did you flip in your packet? There we go. Okay, I was like, wait, did it say cluster? Okay, good.
Yeah, be like this. Like you can pull it and then very specific details.
You guys decided on what your groups are going to be? No, cluster, you would separate them into groups, you take the entire group. Stratified is where you separate them into groups and then that group. That's the difference. Because you're right, they're both like, it's just what you do.
Okay, it's a good book that I like. And yeah, so like the teacher told me to read some books about confidence.
Oh no.
There are books that like, am I gonna really read about like some made up Harry Potter?
So you're supposed to be saying that.
No, but like, I'll read like realistic, not historical. History makes sense.
So really, it can't be too creative.
Yeah. Uncomfortable. But like, how am I gonna keep track of all these people whose names sound so
You could, I think one easier way, a better representation is like, these are your 4 strategies, and then you want 8 total.
Well, how do
Does that make sense?
yeah.
Okay.
I'm supposed to be reading it now. I read, you know the book with the guy and they have a part-time book and whatever it's called? Oh, that one wasn't awful. I read all of those. That's
How did you figure it? I would say that is like,
the reason that I can't read books like that is because it stresses me out. You know, like if I'm like in the middle and like it's like a bad part. No, little Harry Potter for example. It's like parts that are like scary.
like left alone. All right, guys, let's go through this one. All right, what I would start with, again, guys, be very specific. I know you don't want to write a lot. You have to write a decent amount of this. I would start by saying, put names.
All 5 names.
5 senior. I'm going to start with the seniors. put in hat? How many of you talked about putting names in a hat? Yes, okay, good. Blindly pick 2 names, okay? And specify no replacement or without replacement. Okay. All right, then I would say repeat for remaining grades. Like that's okay, repeat for junior, sophomores, freshmen. And then at the end, tell me again those. Okay. How are we doing with the detail? Okay. All right. Try the next one. The one next to that, the cluster sample. See if you can figure out how this is different. So, does anybody need this one up here longer, or are we okay with the? Read the cluster sample one and think about how you're going to do a cluster sample. It's still grouping, but it's going to be different. You gotta know what's going on. It's all just all right, guys, how are we doing clustering? Oh, I'm sorry.
Assign.
No, you're fine. Can you read it?
Yeah.
I feel like I did not write right.
Great. Clustering going. Yes, try cluster. Good. So how many groups do you think? So and then the very first
No, you don't have to have the same
Wait a minute, but now we have 5 groups. How are they going to complete people?
Well, yeah, I mean, you want it to make sense so that if it does represent the population, you don't really want to be like, okay, 4 seniors and 1 junior. Yeah, you know what I mean? Like,
not like you're picking an entire cluster.
So what if you said like, I don't know. I got that.
What'd you say, Kyle? So that's the question.
So you have 5 groups. Yeah, I was 8. Yeah, I saw 8.
You have 5 groups of 4.
Yes.
Yes, I think like last time.
So when you cluster,
Oh, that's what you mean.
5 groups of 4.
But you cluster by, but if you take too close.
Yeah, I want to cluster by grade. You gotta cluster in a way where you can actually get 8.
So then we.
And we want it to.
So you want
That's what she
to
said.
It took me a way.
It took you a while too.
Or then you ran
Yeah.
assign a number to each cluster. I don't know how to get that in
I speak English.
Would you have to specify exactly how you cluster it, or do you just say?
You could even like.
Oh my
Circle on the name.
Yeah, but.
Cluster 1, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll have to ask you.
But then let's
Oh no.
Or like, yeah, they do.
No, where you going?
Or else.
You follow around.
There's 5 groups. I just said that. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Gonna be like right these two cuts and then. Yeah. I would go with clusters.
Yeah.
Okay, does I see something else? I'm just gonna
Oh, it really is not.
Oh, you are good.
Yeah.
Never had any more.
No, I know. Okay, we do not want to be clustered over here. Think about it, you want to end up with 8 people, it's going to impact how you cluster. For instance, your cluster. Make it more complicated than it needs to be. Yeah, and so when you cluster, like the biggest thing you remember here is like how many groups. You can't pick like maybe you've got
Yeah. Two people in the meeting.
okay, 2 by group.
Since there's 5 in each group.
I'll go first. All right, guys, let's talk about our clustering. Okay, guys. You want to make sure that your clustering makes sense so that when you pick whole groups at the end, you actually end up with 8 people. You can't be like, oh, I'm clustering by grades and I picked 2 grades and now I have 10 people.
that doesn't work, okay? And you want your clusters to actually represent the population too. So I would go ahead and group students into 5 groups of 4. And then I would say either to define it 1 student from each grade, or you could say like shown above and go, okay, like, so there's my first cluster, there's my second cluster, there's my third, fourth, fifth, okay? So I now have 5 groups. All right. So all 4 names on 1 piece of paper. Say something about like, do this for each group or cluster. If you wanted to call it that. And then make a note like, okay, so I have 5 pieces of paper, right? Okay, papers go in hat. Blindly choose 2. Without replacement. And those 8 students go into the capital. Does it make sense seeing it up here? Okay. Is it simpler than what some of you chose for your clusters? Okay. Try to pick a simple path. You don't have to make it super complicated to create your clusters. Make it represent the group though. Question. So how many names are on each piece of paper? 4. So if I pick 2 sheets of paper, I now have 8 people. Yep. And again, guys, that's what a cluster is you pick the entire group. You don't pick a group and then sample within the group. You are just taking, okay, here's group 1, group 2, that's my 8 people and done. Okay? Do we see the difference between cluster and stratify? Okay. Once you're done jotting down what you need about that, oh, yeah, Kelly, what do you have? It actually is probably going to make it more representative if you define, like, I'm putting you 4 or 5 people, 4 people together for this reason. Because I want you, because now when I pick 2, I'm going to have 2 seniors, 2 juniors, 2 sophomores, 2 freshmen. Okay. Oh, thank you. That's awesome. All right, guys, stop there. I realize we're about out of time. You have some textbook problems you can start on. You have the data journals. We will do the rest of the notes Tuesday. Data journals concept quiz Thursday. Test following Monday. I know, and then we're done learning new stuff for AP Stat.
That means it turns into NACOT.
Heck no, it turns into reviewing for the AP exam.
It's back your life.